So that is a high-level overview of the issues. It is a high-level draft plan that is out for submissions, and I think the key message is really that it would be useful to have a more in-depth process with local government and Mana Whenua to make this process as useful as possible.
When does it cease to be a draft?
Sorry?
When does it cease to be a draft?
I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date when they're intending to publish it.
Thanks. So there are 4 recommendations receiving the report, noting the draft National Adaptation Plan out for consultation, noting a draft of the proposed regional submission, and confirming that we wish to be included in that. So with that high-level overview, and apologies for the fact that you haven't been able to read through it in detail, I'm happy to move, or test the meeting and move the 4 recommendations. I'll look for a seconder, Councillor Soper, and open for feedback. If anybody's not comfortable, now's the time to register that, or if you wish to support it. Councillor Soper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support it. I think it's a useful thing for us, very useful thing for us to be involved in. But because it is still in draft form, I just want to make the comment, some of the sentences in the draft are quite convoluted. Rhiannon has given us a very straightforward explanation of the points. I just feel there is a little bit more drafting to really give this the punch of a submission that is going to be read and taken note of. So I just want to make that comment.
Thank you. Any other comments? Reverend Cook.
Just because I'm really nudish, the Ministry for the Environment is not Te Kawanatanga o Aotearoa, because that's the government as a whole. It's Manatua Te Taiao.
Thank you. Note that. Other questions or comments? Or nerdisms? If not, I'll put it to the vote. All in favour? Aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thanks for that, Rhiannon. Right, that brings us to the annual plan deliberations, and we'll start off with a correction on what I incorrectly put out as the process for before. As to today, the 14th of June and the 28th, which is when the rate is struck. Rhiannon, do you want to run through that process just so that everybody's clear on it and give it to us correctly rather than the version that I did?
So the process today is to deliberate on what you've heard from submissions and the updated information that's included within the report around the financial position, as well as the options put forward by officers. So you'll see in the final recommendation, which is number 15, it notes to recommend to council to adopt the plan, incorporating or not incorporating. So it may well be that by the end of these deliberations you get to the point where you are ready to recommend to council to adopt, and then essentially the decision making for the annual plan is complete. If there are further options that haven't been considered, that need further consideration, or you don't reach final kind of decisions on key points today, then there is the option to consider again on the 14th of June. On the 14th of June, you will also receive the report on fees and charges schedule and adopt the fees and charges schedule on that date. And you will receive the results of the consultation and deliberate on the Roaring Forties consultation, which will be input as well. And then the annual plan will be adopted on the 28th of June by council. So that is a broader process. Claire, is there any other element you wanted to mention at this point? No.
My question to the chair in writing was whether council would wish, whether officers would recommend that council adopt the annual plan on the 14th. Whether that would get you a head start on financial work for the incoming year.
We would be able to do that with the exception that we need to finish the Roaring Forties element, which will then be incorporated.
So we'll wait and see.
Thank you. Right, if we go through it section by section for discussion purposes and questions of clarity, then we will go through the recommendations after that. Councillor Clark.
Yes, Chair, just wanted to clarify what was just said by Rhiannon and by Chief Executive. bringing forward a date to adopt the plan till the 14th of June means that today we have to be happy with the information in front of us. And I'm certainly not in that position, so I can't speak for others. So I think your advice to start with was the way to go. Work our way through the advice in this paper, come to the conclusion at the end, yes, we're comfortable to adopt the plan, or alternatively, we need some further information.
I agree, we would be at a better place to understand what shape of meeting we'll have on the 14th of June at the end of today. Councillor Pottinger.
Thank you, Chair. Look, again, just some clarity on when would a member, say, give us 10 cents worth on the entire annual plan thing, you know, rather than picking bits by bits. If you just wanted to give when would be the appropriate time for that?
Well, I'd like to go through and give people the chance to ask questions for a start, and I'll go through it section by section.
Right.
And then feedback and comments at the end once we get into
Okay. So
looking at the recommendations.
Comments and
If you have any questions before then, by all means, stick your hand up.
Thank you.
Rhiannon, we're in your hands. Where would you like to start?
So if we start with the overview of forecast financials and the forecast rates increase, I'll just run through some of the headline points, and Patricia's here to answer any specific questions you might have. So essentially this overview is split into two sections. It talks about the differences between the LTP forecast for 22-23 and the consultation draft forecast for 2023, and then it talks about the changes following consultation as a result of Q3 reforecasting. So it's just split into those two sections. So you'll note that there was a shift in the capital expenditure from 45.4 million in the LTP and 110.9 million operational expenditure. And by the time we went out to consultation, you had been through the process of looking at all the issues in that table, which is headed changes from the LTP, and that resulted in a change to 72.6 million capital expenditure and 115.9 million operational expenditure. So that change resulted in a change in shift in the rates from 4% to 7.78% at the time of consultation. Now, for the eagle-eyed amongst you who might note that all those elements within the table don't add to the difference in the operational expenditure, I will note that that difference is the depreciation. So you'll recall that a revaluation during the time since the long-term plan resulted in a change of the value of our assets and therefore the costs of depreciation. So those headline elements within that table were what we consulted on with the community about the changes that have been seen as a result of changes in the economic environment and changes to the decision making that you as councillors had made on a number of key projects, including City Street Stage 2 and the preferred option for the museum. So I won't go through all the other changes in that table, but those are familiar to us and to the community from consultation. Over the time of the consultation period, then reforecasting were complete. So as a result of that reforecasting, there's been a small further change to the forecast capital expenditure and operational expenditure, moving up to 74.2 million capital expenditure and 116.4 million operational expenditure. But you'll note that that change actually results in a small drop in the forecast rates increase to 7.15%. So all those changes are listed below. I will just touch on them briefly, and then if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take those. So the first one was a correction due to the modelling for infrastructure, which was as a result of the significant change to the rating approach made in 2021. So the correct amount of revenue has been raised, but essentially it's a problem within the budget model. So that's been incorporated. City Street Stage 2 was not included within the LTP, but was separately consulted on. At the time that we went out for consultation, the whole amount of the rates increase that would be required for that project was included in 22-23. So now we're proposing spreading that out, and that balance actually more accurately reflecting when the work will take place. So that reduces the amounts of the rate increase required next year. There's also been a change to the government subsidy revenue. So that's purely a timing of when that money has come into the budget, and that results in an increase within this current financial year and a decrease next year. So that just has to be factored into modelling. There's been a change to the solid waste revenue and expenditure, and this is around changes that we're seeing flowing through now over the time of lockdown, increased amounts of waste coming through, and increases to the emission trading scheme costs. There's decreased revenue from the building consent services, reduced capital forecasts, in particular relating to those 3 water projects discussed above, and an accounting error in the double up of the water supply repairs. As a result of Q3 forecasting, there has also been some savings which officers have been able to make across the accounts. So that explains why the shift in change since the time we consulted, reducing the rates increase from 778 to 7.15. So if councillors have got any questions on that overview at this point.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Just before we go to questions, I'll just observe that the video for the live stream has once again frozen, but the audio is continuing. I'm not going to adjourn and allow it to restart. The audio is there. And for those that are on the live stream and still listening, thank you for your persistence. That's the way it's going to be. I'm sure you can do without our visual gorgeousness. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Rhiannon, just a couple of questions on what you said. The government subsidy, I've already asked this question, but I'd just like you to clarify for me again. If we've got the government subsidy coming in for shovel ready and 3 waters work, if the money comes in this financial year, which is 20, 21, 22, but the work is not either undertaken or not completed until a future year, I don't understand why we've got a potential surplus one year and a potential deficit the following year. I mean, it's standard practice in all sectors, including local government sector, to use contingent liabilities. So, and I don't know why that isn't explained. And for those that are listening in, a contingent liability is where you get money in one fiscal year and you can, from an audit perspective, carry it across the end of a financial result at the end of June to allow you to make payments in the following year, which is when those payments occur. So I don't understand why we don't have an explanation of that.
Patricia, can you give an answer to that?
I can give an explanation to that, councillor. The funds in question, we now do believe we have expended them, so can recognise them as revenue in the 21-22 financial year. It was planned that we wouldn't be able to because that project hadn't started, but they've actually spent the money on pipes, so we can apply the government funding towards the pipes.
So we don't have any unders and overs at the end of the year, is that what you're saying?
That's what the current forecast is.
Yep.
Does that answer your question, councillor?
It does. And the other question for me, which is a lead into further questions further down the track, when we consider the 4.4% increase in the long-term plan, and we're now looking to a 7.15 increase, what's that? Just want to know what that extra 3.15 is in dollar terms. It's my understanding it's somewhere between 2 million and 2.1 million. I just want affirmation that that's the level of increase that we're trying to fund.
Are you able to answer that on the hoof, Patricia, or would you need some time?
It's just around, it's between 1.8 and 2 million on the hoof.
Thank you.
Further questions, councillor?
No, I'm happy with that at that stage.
Thank you. Councillors, any other questions on that section for Rhiannon or Patricia? If not, we'll move on to the next section. Thanks, Rhiannon.
So the next section of the report deals with the feedback from the community as part of consultation. So I've split this into 2 sections. The first is on Te Anua, Southern Museum and Art Gallery, and the second is on other options to manage the rates increase. Just a reminder that the results of the consultation on the fees and charges and on a Tisbury reserve are coming in separate reports. So really the main takeaway from the feedback from the community on the Southern Museum and Art Gallery was that the council's preferred option, the larger new build, was also the preferred option from the community. That was the more chosen option, with option 1 to redevelop the existing building still remaining a pretty popular choice. I think that this report also deals with some of the specific concerns and queries around how the projects will actually be delivered that I've pulled up here for you to consider in terms of how the officers are planning for those. I won't go into those in detail. I'll just probably draw your attention to the fact that really what the public were wanting to see was a do it once and do it right. And so that's probably the question for consideration later as you come on to the assessment of the options and what makes best sense to you as councillors. The other key message coming through was around delivering it, getting it open as quickly as possible, but there is no difference between the options on that matter. So I'll leave it there on the feedback on the museum, unless there are any questions on that.
Councillors? Councillor Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Rhiannon, I just want to backtrack a little bit onto the long-term plan. In the long-term plan, we offered the community 2 options. One was to re-strengthen the museum and get it open, and we got 72% of those that made comment about that, and it was quite a large capture group. Said they wanted the museum strengthened and reopened. The other option we gave them was to do nothing and to consider other options, which only got support of 20%, so 1 in every 5. And so I guess in some ways the annual plan's only got a much smaller number of people coming forward, and it just seems to have gone. We've picked up, I think Councillor Pottinger and Councillor Arnold both raised earlier on about, we get feedback from people, we just go off in another direction. So I just wonder what our view was, that we've now really gone down to the new museum option, because as you quite rightly said, the issue is they wanted something done quickly, and the new museum's not a quick fix. Just like your views on that.
Do you want to have a crack at that, Rhiannon?
I think you make a good point, Councillor Clark, about the lower numbers submitting in this engagement. I think that is very much a reflection of 2 things: the timing of the Omicron pandemic, and also the fact that people feel that they have shared their views a lot on the museum. That is why within this report I've also included more detailed information on that broader engagement, to give you an assurance of those wider conversations that were taking place on social media and at the farmers market. So I guess the only other point I will make is that when we had conversations with people at the farmers market, that obviously the question of timing came up, and I think people, once they understand that all options are essentially being delivered in the same time frame, you cannot deliver option 1 any faster than the other options, then people were considering that issue as well.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Rhiannon, just so I can get it straight in my mind exactly, Councillor Clark's point perhaps. Option 1, basically do nothing, with either strengthen or do nothing. Option 2, the hero version. Option 3, a good version also. But in actual fact, if you loosely say there are 2 options, do nothing, do something, the figures for option 2 and 3, i.e. to do something about it, were grossly higher percentage, and a high percentage of the total votes.
I see where you're going with that, Councillor, but I don't think the community interpreted option 1 as do nothing. I think they did interpret it how council meant it, which was to renovate and redevelop the existing building, but as you say, while noting the serious limitations with that option. Yeah.
So the figures for option 2 and 3 combined were substantially higher than
yes,
option 1.
yep.
So yeah, thank you.
Reverend Cook.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Would it be fair to say that the way people have responded within the annual plan is because of how highlighted Te Unua was in the annual plan, in that respect that there was substantial amount of what we sent out, including the imaging and all those sorts of things, as opposed to being part of the long-term plan, but also that it had a much more concrete process and imagining, if you like, that went along with it. And that includes how it was presented at the farmers market and places like that. It seems to me that when I looked at the long-term plan, the place of redeveloping the museum, and that was much, while it was there, it was not quite as alternative focused as it was on what do we do with Niho Te Taniwha, as opposed to what might some other thing be. That is my, as I was a member of the public at that time, that was my perception of it, and I wonder if that has coloured the responses that we got back once it was singled out in the way that we did in the annual plan process.
I think what you can take from it is that there was good understanding on both occasions of the options, and actually the options were quite different. In the first consultation, it was renovate the existing building or do nothing and boost up He Wakaturia in the meantime to give more time for a solution. Now the options were to renovate the existing building or to build a new build. And I think if I may give my feedback on what I saw from the public, that the subtlety between the sizes of the two new build was the part perhaps that the public wasn't able to engage with as effectively. But when they were clear on the choice was between either a new build or retaining the existing building, then I think you can be quite confident in the results here were also backed up on what you see in social media and in conversations, that the new build and do it once, do it right was what the public were saying.
Thank you. Councillor Emerson.
Thanks, Chair. I guess one of the things that surprised me with the feedback that we got about the differences between option 2 and 3 was actually that people didn't really seem to appreciate or realise the risk involved in going with the council's preferred option over the $65 million option, because that risk is around the need for external funding, because there was actually very little difference between, I think the weekly rates for the $65 million option was $3.22, and for the other option it was $3.30 a week. So a very little difference there for an extra $10 million, but that was because that $10 million was mostly made up by external funding, which has been pointed out by the staff to us as being the significant risk. I'm wondering whether perhaps we didn't necessarily highlight that as well as we should have to the public, but I'm also wondering whether that risk profile has changed at all, because to me that seems like the difference between whether option 2 or 3 is the preferred option going forward.
So I'll provide a response to the first part of that question, and then perhaps Steve, I can't actually see him, but he might like to answer that second part of that question. So I think firstly, I agree that on reflection, we could have put more clearer messages up front about risk. I think though it's very hard, and I don't know realistically what difference that would have made. Risk as a topic is not one that human beings relate to very well. And when you're doing an engagement like this, we're trying to provide as much clarity over what the differences are between all the options. It was described at various points in the consultation document. But I agree, we could have said more about that.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, kia ora, councillors, your worship. Look, in terms of the second part of that question, has the risk changed at all? Have we got greater confidence around funding? Can we manage the risk of council through $11 million or $20 million? The answer is nothing's changed in our advice. We still believe that that poses a significant risk for this project, and that's why our officer advice, which is further on in the report, that's why that hasn't changed, because nothing in the external environment has given us the confidence that that money's going to be easy to get. We recognise too, and that was certainly one of the flavours of the consultation that you heard from the community, is that the economy is having an impact on everyone, and as a result we've left our recommendation from staff at the same point that we left it through the consultation document process.
Can I ask another question?
Yep.
So I guess following on from that, in terms of the operations of a $65 million museum and a $75 million museum, is there a significant difference in that? Because I assume that adds even more cost and risk going forward.
Yeah, I think we probably could come back to that later if you want to keep working through Rhiannon stuff. I don't want to take the thunder out of that, but certainly there is an operating difference, and we've noted in the report again that the larger facility will cost a lot more money to run, and that'll all be OPEX. And actually the amount of time and effort we'll need to spend filling those special galleries for touring exhibitions, we haven't worked through all the details there, and so there is a degree of risk on that as well, and we will be at the mercy of the touring shows and exhibitions, and we're going to have to get them to come down to the bottom of New Zealand. So that package has to be quite attractive. We haven't got to that detail yet, but that will be another risk on this, on a slightly larger building. But I guess the point I'd leave you with is our advice around the differences between option 2 and 3 around meeting the vision and the critical success factors hasn't changed either. They're both going to be, we'll do them both right. We only do one right, sorry, we're not going to build 2 museums, but we will do it right. We haven't begun design, but if we get the budget envelope correct and you send us in a direction, we'll deliver.
Thank you. Councillor Clark, I see your hands up, but I've got 2 others who are just, who we haven't heard from as yet, so I'll go to them first. Councillor Scout, then Councillor Pottinger.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a bit perplexed, to be honest. Just could you clarify me the number of ratepayers we have in the city?
25,000.
And we had 120 submitters, is that correct? 120 submitters, is that correct?
111, I think.
111.
On the museum top.
Oh, sorry.
111, of which some were positive and some were negative. Would that be fair? I'm actually not, I don't actually understand why we're having this conversation.
Well, it's part of the process that we work through.
It is, but there's a very clear message. Our community's actually spoken.
Note your feelings. Thank you. Councillor Pottinger, then Councillor Soper.
Through your chair, question is for Steve. And the question is regarding the size difference, the square meterage difference between option 2 and option 3. Would that impact on 2 key revenue elements of a new museum, that being a cafe and a retail store? Because I know they are prominent in museums all around New Zealand. So if you don't go for the 2 and went the 3, is that impacted on?
The simple answer is yes, it will be impacted on. It'll be a smaller square metre rate in both cases. And if we haven't determined the operating model on that, whether it's a lease or in-house, I think in the model we do have a lease just to help round out the budget. We need to come back to you on that exact operating platform. But yeah, square metres will be smaller, and so the potential to fit more people in and sell more things will be slightly reduced. But it won't, I don't think it'll be a significant, because we're talking a cut across the entire facility.
Okay, so the impact will not be half the retail area and half the cafe. It may be, like, percentage-wise, because that is dramatic.
We haven't gone through the design process and exactly aligning up how much we allocate, but we recognise that to create a destination you need food and you need a retail opportunity there too. So they will be different. 2 is largely unconstrained. 3 will be constrained, but we'll be a bit more flexible about the floor space.
So, as well as the square meterage, obviously, then the revenue, which will help pay for the thing, would be constrained as well, because theoretically you couldn't make as much, you couldn't turn over as many people, and you wouldn't have the obviously the statues of tuataras and old museum replicas for sale.
Yes.
Snow
through you,
globes.
Mr. Chair, you look technically right. Again, that will depend on the operating model that we come back to you with.
Right. Thank you.
Councillor Soper.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Funnily enough, through you, mine was also a square meterage question, and it's partly based on the consultation events I attended, and my own reading of the various submissions and the online submissions. Both the new options, option 3 and option 2, were larger proposals than the current museum. It seemed to me in the consultations I took part in that when that was pointed out to people, that option 3 was 400, I'm rounding things up here, option 3 was 400 square metres larger than our current museum, and option 2 was another 600 metres larger, that a lot of the people who then fed back to me didn't think there was that greater difference between the two. Did we convey enough that both those options were larger than the current option, I suppose is what I'm asking? Because I did find a lot of confusion in discussing that with people, that many people thought option 3 was a smaller option until I went through the actual statistics we had been as councillors provided with. Did we convey that clearly enough to people?
I think that's a fair point, councillor, that we could have done a better job in comparing the difference between the 2 new build options and the size of the existing building. It is detailed in the consultation document and was discussed there. I get, again, like the risk factor, there are so many different factors in relation to this project, which I think also the feedback from submitters on all the different details underneath that they're interested in shows that it's hard to pitch a clear message and get all the details right. All the details were correct and out there, but did people pick up on them?
Thanks. It's difficult to shine a light on every subject. Councillor Clark, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Chair. Just a follow on from some other questions in relation to what Rhiannon said and what Evelyn said as well. I think, Rhiannon, you stated that you thought the lowest submission that due to COVID, and possibly because people had already shared their views, which is what you said, is it a fair reflection that maybe people had shared their reviews on the long-term plan on the options and felt they weren't listened to and therefore didn't participate the second time round? So that's one issue you might want to comment on. And the other issue is the...
I think that's a rhetorical question, Nobby, and I'm not sure how we could expect Rhiannon to answer that in good faith.
One other issue on page 7 of the report, on page 157 of board books, it talks about what is this museum? Is it an Invercargill museum or is it a regional Southern museum? And it's the latter. That's the advice we're given. And so that begs the question that are we paying a disproportionate share of the new museum and the ongoing OPEX costs when other councils should be contributing more than what they pay through their heritage fees?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Look, the collection is managed through a regional contribution from the councils, and I think we've progressed on that. We're not in a position at this stage to comment. I can't comment on the council. I don't know, Claire, if you wish to make any statement on that.
Claire, please.
Mr. Chair, my advice to that question is going to be uncharacteristically blunt. If you wish to pursue a contribution from Southland and Gore, other than the regional heritage rate, then the project will stop in its tracks. And we have got the clarity around the museum trust deed now. The interim board met on Friday, and the work around appointing a new board, skills-based board, will commence in about 6 weeks. But if we were to now go to other local authorities, then there would be a pause put on this, which experience would tell us would change the cost from 65 to 75 million to 95 to 105 million. I think that Invercargill needs to determine whether it wants a museum for Invercargill and make its decision on that basis.
Thank
Through
you.
you, Chair.
So just if I can just add, that is probably where the previous projects had stalled as well, bearing in mind that both Southland and Gore districts have their own specific stories being told in their areas. I guess what has been missing from what's been referred to as the Southland Museum and Art Gallery is any great reflection of Invercargill. And I think the opportunity that exists is in around reflecting where Invercargill's story sits and how that sits in the context of Southland. So while we talk about it as a South Museum, it's really looking at it as the museum in Invercargill with part of a collection that belongs to Southland. Reverend Cook.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. I think that it was something that the visiting group was mindful of when they chose the name Te Unua. It has no connotations of location or a particular area, but it is inclusive of the collection. And the collection is what is going to be housed in the building. What we name it and taking it away from being the Southland Museum and Art Gallery may resolve some of that sort of angst about who is actually paying for the building. It's located in Invercargill. Invercargill City has taken ownership of housing the regional collection within its building and displaying and showcasing it. The collection is available to other museums in the region, but the principal place of location will be in the principal location of the province. And to me, I don't see what the contradiction is, but however, does that help you, Councillor Clark, if it is a non-location-based name? Does that help?
Oh, I think it definitely helps. We're paying for it and have the ongoing costs. We should have the ownership. And I think Councillor Ludlow gave a good description there where he said it needs to be or should be a Invercargill City Museum, but it does tell a story of the wider region.
Okay, councillors, now we are actually starting to get into the debate, so I'll pull it back. No, that's my fault. I let that happen and took part in it too. So I'll bring us back to any questions about what Rhiannon's raised with that part. If not, next item.
Okay, so the next elements of feedback from the community were around the wider annual plan, and this message that came through most strongly was around rates affordability. The rates rebate program was raised in a number of times during the hearing, so I'll just note that there are communications planned for this month and next month, in fact already taking place on that program. The second element of feedback related to capital delivery, whether of the main projects or of the general capital program. So I've just summarised here some of the key points that people are making. People are really split between whether we should proceed and get all the projects delivered as fast as possible, or whether they believe that as councillors you should trim the capital program in order to make savings. I will just reflect on the fact that obviously this is a small number of the whole ratepayers that have submitted on this issue. I'll just cover the issue of accurate forecasting and management costs that was raised by some submitters, including the Invercargill Ratepayers Association. So I've provided a breakdown in the report of where the actual cost increases sit, and whether those relate to decisions which council has made in the case of the museum and Stead Street, Stockbank, or whether they relate to increases that have come through because of the marketplace, including the Branks Home water supply and Stead Street Stockbank. So at this point, I'll just pause because I believe there's an update on the Branks Home.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Look, we just wanted to provide a really early update for council on the progress of our procurement process, and the tender process has been concluded today. As a result of this, we're restricted to sort of the information that we can advise you based on the advice from our probity order and procurement team. But as a result of the tender process, we are signalling that we will need to rephase the delivery of the Branks Home pipeline, and that this may include impacts on the time required and possible budget. However, we do wish to signal too that there will be, with a different delivery approach, enough funding to commence the work next financial year and to continue this work the following financial year as planned. And once the team have undertaken a review of the process and can refocus on the delivery method, we will come back to you to update you on the new proposed method of delivery and expected completion dates. So I just wanted to give you a quick update on that.
Thanks, Steve.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure whether I heard clearly enough that we may need additional funding, but it won't be for some time. But I just want to give you an early heads up.
Councillors clear on that? Anyone surprised? No. I guess the good news is the opportunity to stage it will allow a greater chance for success and for us to cope with those changes financially. Is that fair, Steve? Thanks. Questions around those issues? No?
Yes.
Sorry, Councillor Clark.
Yes, a series of questions about the rate affordability for Rhiannon, or possibly for Michael if he's around. In the suite of options that you've put in the report that you've considered, there are some things for me that are missing in the consideration of how we might fund that extra 3.15, which is around about the $1.9 million mark. So I'll just run through those. Why have we got no consideration about an unbalanced budget, which is permitted by Section 102 of the Local Government Act?
Patricia, do you want to?
Oh, so we actually will be running an unbalanced budget as a result of the subsidy moving. We didn't further want to run a further unbalanced budget because this actually results in us pushing operational costs onto our mokopuna and onto future generations to actually fund the cost of actually not living within our means now.
So just to clarify, the operational costs are what we require for the day-to-day running of council, whereas the stuff that is best treated intergenerationally are the larger capital projects.
Correct.
Thanks. Councillor Clark.
Yeah, through you, Chair. I just come back on that comment. Look, I can't sit here and take that comment. To be talking about putting costs onto mokopuna is outrageous. We've got $49.2 million sitting in our cash reserves. We could take $1.8 million out of that and get the extra 3.15 that we're asked for. If we bump rates up by 7.15, that's where the mokopunas get hurt, because that rate doesn't just impact on this year, it compounds for every year thereafter. And so I just can't take those sort of comments sitting down. So I guess I still have the issue of why we weren't given that lever. The other issues for me are, and we signalled this in a report that I put forward on behalf of the Ratepayers Group, there was no breakdown of personnel costs. So for those listening in, personnel costs are about nearly 25% of all the money we spend operationally every year in council. So that is a big, big chunk of money, and it's a one-liner. So if you have an unbalanced budget, so we ran $1.8 million short in our revenue area, we could during the year find ways to trim back our costs, which is what most organisations would do. So I don't know why in this report we don't have a breakdown of the personnel costs. I appreciate that.
Can I address that, Councillor?
Certainly.
Partially the operational side of it when it comes to staff is not our purview. But at the same time, when we've got quite a few vacancies around and we've had wage increases, I'm not sure where we can sit above that and look for trimmings. In some senses where there's vacancies that we have been unable to fill, and that is simply the result of the job market that exists in the country at the moment, and I'm not sure whether it's going to get worse or better with the borders opening. The fact remains that there are positions that are unfilled, and some of those tasks have to be met by contractors, and that comes at a cost. And that's about ensuring the day-to-day work happens. So I'm not sure where in there we can set a directive through this process that's going to make cost savings.
Yep, just as a response to that, Chair, personnel cost is not about salaries. It's a much wider picture than that. So it's not about trimming staff. I've never suggested that. And I appreciate the vacancies that are being considered to be held, because annual leave also has some other very large figures in it, which we can control. So one of them is accrued annual leave. Staff build up annual leave as they go through the year. And if they don't use it in a timely manner, that sits on the balance sheet. And everybody that's worked in finance knows that. So that's an area we could do better in. I don't know what our current liability is there because I can't get the breakdown. We have legal costs and we have consultants. And the consultants can be very large as well. And so we could put some constraints around our spending in there and ideally claw back part or all of the $1.8 million. So I don't know why we don't have that breakdown. And I guess the other issue is there are two other issues. When I asked recently about whether we could use some of our cash investments, there was a gasp from the staff saying, no, we can't do that because it affects our net debt. So for those listening in, net debt is the difference between what you have by way of debt and what you have sitting as cash or cash investments in the bank. And so our net debt's about $90 million, give a little bit of change. And so 1.8, if we added that by either by borrowing more money or alternatively not borrowing, but using some of the cash, that 1.8, according to Michael at the last meeting, would not change our credit rating. It's not significant enough to do that. And that's been reinforced recently that our cash investments have dropped from 53 million down to 49.2. So that's a $3.8 million withdrawal of money, I guess, to be used for a range of costs. So that can be done. Why can't it be done next year? And I'm not asking Rhiannon to answer that, but it would have been helpful in our report to look at those levers. So there's a range of levers there, and I think we've got a very narrow look at that at this stage.
So I'll go to Claire. I think some of what Councillor Clark was referring to in his first statement there is largely operational. I'm not sure that from a governance perspective it's up to us to direct how leave is managed, but I understand that in the broader sense, the outstanding leave balance has been significantly managed down over recent years. Is that true?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The answer is yes. If I was asked, have we been paying attention to the annual leave accrued, the contingent liabilities that show on the balance sheet, the answer would be that I've been working on that since I came. Mr. Gibbling would confirm that GMs receive an annual leave balance for all staff approximately every 8 weeks. And we monitor it for exactly the reason that Councillor Clark has stated.
Patricia, if I can come to you on the second point that Councillor Clark has raised, which is around net debt and our ability to use some of reserves to cover off that slightly below $2 million. Do you have a response to that?
So by using the reserves to cover off the the 1.8 million, it actually increases and net debt or decreases it, increases their borrowing. So that 1.8 we wouldn't be able to use to fund capital projects. We'd have to go borrow that 1.8. So while we have the cash, we use the cash intermittently with borrowing. So that's how you would end up having to borrow for it anyway.
It would decrease our interest revenue and increase our interest expense.
Thank you.
So just as a response to that, because I'm not sure I'm happy with that, it doesn't affect our credit rating. We've already had that confirmed. And it's all very well to say, well, we don't want to take money out of the bank because we might need that at a later stage, given that we have our ability to borrow from the local government funding agency at much lower market rates than probably any other business in the country because of our credit rating and the fact that we're a local government. But yet we're quite happy to push the rates up, and those rates compound year after year after year. And so ratepayers wear the cost of that. But the other issue that's not in there is, can we use borrowing? Could we borrow some money for that 1.8? I'd like to know what Patricia's got to think about that. Borrow for operational costs as opposed to capex.
So I guess with my financial background, I would say borrowing for operational costs is not a smart move. For capital costs, yeah, for OPEX, no. But it is a juggling process there.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it is a juggling process, and it's not one that I would recommend that we borrow to fund our operating costs.
But
it's like borrowing for the groceries.
You could. It's kind of like going into overdraft with your bank without asking them.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Another question there, Councillor?
No, that's me done on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Rhiannon.
Just to note that there is an opportunity. We have got all the levers kind of discussed in the paper, and we'll work through them. So I'll just briefly touch on last two specific issues that came up through the consultation. So that was Esk Street West. So just to note that feedback from the local developer around that new hotel, there are some options in that area, and it's recommended it be considered as part of the long-term plan. However, if there were any functional improvements that were needed by the developer at this point, there is not budget to do those. Those would need to be at the developer's cost. And secondly, the submission from the Southland, Mountain Bike Club around the Bluff Motupuhui Recreation Precinct. Just to note that car park has already been brought forward into this financial year coming up in order to support that application to the Tourism Infrastructure Fund for those projects. So that kind of just wraps up the summary from the public, and then the rest of the report deals with the options now for council to consider.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Before we get into the recommendations, and I will go through them in a kind of bitsy manner, I'll give councillors the opportunity to raise any issues, concerns, or points from a more holistic perspective that they'd like to make now. I see Councillor Pottinger champing at the bit. Yeah,
what we seem to be discussing is so micro that we're ignoring the bigger problem. I mean, this year's annual plan we consulted on a rates rise of 7.78. It's now been revised 7.15. This was a final result after discovered financial information, and this is the number we're deliberating on today. In isolation, one could say that this may be a solitary speed wobble and our long-term plan, the road to renewal. Okay, you get this right, we're back on track, and then this is where Councillor Clark raises the issue about the 4% forecast rate rises. Are they actually real? I don't see this as correcting the long-term plan, and now I believe the long-term plan is way too ambitious, and it's actually fiscally unachievable in its consulted form. And why? Okay, so we've got to Unua, the new museum. So most likely we'll go ahead in the option 2 format, which leaves $20 million that is unfunded. We have to find. What's the next project? We have the Branksome pipeline, which we've just been updated on. It was budgeted in the long-term plan at 11 million. It's now gone to 25 million. That's an extra 14. We now have adding in there, which is yet to be consulted on, Streetscape Stage 2. There's $14. That's $14 million. That's not even in the long-term plan. We've also got the Civic Administration Building. Now, this is quite alarming. It's budgeted at $16 million in the LTP. Yet, I was looking at the minutes of the Risk and Assurance meeting from the 23rd of March, and it shows the forecast is now 27.9 for that. Now, that's a public document, and it shows they're forecasting the Civic Administration Building at 27.9. But that's not, they aren't the worrying factors. The worrying factor is bank interest rates. Now, this report tells us that a 0.5% increase in the bank interest rate results in 1.25% on council rates. Now, this is not just concerning for council borrowings, but if you look at a holding company and the debt that it has, a bank interest rate hike here is going to impact without a doubt on our dividends from them, but also it's going to increase the cost of our city's involvement in City Block. Look, agreeing today on a 7.15 rates increase is not going to fix anything. The whole LTP needs to be revisited. Look, there's nothing wrong with being ambitious, but it's got to be affordable. And I've made a wee analogy here. If council wants to get the public on board with its future plans, it needs to place itself in the public's shoes. So we all know, without a doubt, the basic household budget's been decimated by food prices and by petrol. So what would a responsible household do in our situation? So let's take the Branksome pipeline and call it an essential and very expensive plumbing upgrade. And then let's take the streetscape upgrade stage 2, that's Kelvin Street, and call that decorative landscaping. And it's not hard to figure out what a household would choose to do on a restricted budget. I mean, we're not here to change the LTP today, but we are here to show leadership and a way forward. See, no doubt this council has operating cost increases, and I've seen them, and they're real. They can't be ignored, and along with the 0.62 increase that comes from museum option 2, there are reasons for an increase over that LTP's 4%. I don't believe a forced 4% rates increase is going to help us. I think it will put us backwards. But I would sooner look at, and I was fascinated by the rates affordability benchmark, and that's the local government cost index supplied by Burrell, and then plus 3%, and that equates to 5.4% increase. And I actually believe that this is a more acceptable number for this year. Now, I'm not sure whether, Mr. Chair, this is the right time to move an amendment to what we have in front of us.
There's nothing to amend.
Well, we've got some figures there that are going to carry on. So will we have an opportunity to amend those at the next meeting?
Amend the figures, or
amend the 7.15.
Well, you can amend that at this meeting.
Okay. Well,
resolutions to go through.
So I would wish, because I was a bit confused with how the notes and noting and the recommendations were going. So, I'd like to amend.
I'll go again and say you can't amend something that's not there. So,
okay.
When we get to, and I'm pretty confident we went through this earlier, item 15, if you're looking at making suggestions around an overall figure there, because that's where we start to mention some numbers, that's probably an appropriate place to do it.
Well, I thought we were actually debating the report right now.
Well, we're debating the report, yes, but you're looking to make an amendment on something that
It's not on the floor yet.
is yet to come.
Can I have a point of order ruling on that, please?
Mr. Chair, it might help if I offer a slightly alternative way of putting it. Councillors, what you've got in front of you is a report which, Mr. Chair, I have to say hasn't even been received yet. So in terms of discussing it, it might be useful if there was a motion to receive the report so that it can be debated. Then from any councillor's point of view, they can move the recommendations from the staff in the report or alternatives. And that's not an amendment, that is your right as the elected members.
Okay.
Once something has been moved and seconded, then anybody else who wishes to make a change would be making an amendment.
Right. Now, to assist the process before you jump in, I think it would be useful if we moved recommendations 1 to 5.
Sorry, I just hadn't finished that. That was sorry, may I just finish? I've got a wee bit left. I hadn't finished what I was
Back to your
saying.
notes.
Look. The reason I'm suggesting a 5.4% increase, that is not going to obviously pay for a lot of this stuff, but that's not the problem. The LTP is the problem, and I would only move when the opportunity comes to go to 5.4 on the proviso that the new council in the triennium revisits the LTP at the most practicable time possible. That's early enough. Okay, so those two go hand in hand together. It's not a one-off fix, it's the bigger picture. And if anyone thinks that where is it, $64 million of money we don't have for the LTP is a good thing with that, and that's not including interest rates. We've got some serious stuff to consider.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
It would be useful when we get to that point if you can indicate if we're looking at reducing the overall increase to 5.4 where we're expecting to make those savings, or give some indications on areas where council would prefer to. So yeah, but we're talking about the annual plan for this term. So if you're looking at bringing it down from 7.1 to 5.4, where's the magic?
We are running an unbalanced budget.
Yep, and we took some advice on that earlier about the degree of unbalance that we want to run. So I'll come back to items 1 to 5. So that's first of all receiving the report so we can formally get discussion underway. And 2, 3, 4 and 5 are notes.
Move.
Moved by Councillor Amundsen, second Councillor Soper. That's open for discussion. Put the vote. All in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Against? Carried.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move option 6.
Can you drop the mask? Sorry, Councillor, it's just a little easy to hear.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move recommendation 6 with the determination that we include option 3 for Te Anua in the annual plan. And my reason for moving option 3 is that when we balance the vision and critical success factors that we're all very aware of, the community experience, and it's been emphasised today by our staff that the community experience will be very similar between both the more expensive option 2 and option 3, as well as the risks and the financial costs. I am of the mind to say that option 3 is the much more prudent option for this council to take at the current time. We've been told about the risks inherent in raising $20 million of external funding for option 2 as opposed to 11 million, much more realistically in my opinion, for option 3. We have had advice on the ongoing operational costs that would be much higher for the more expensive option 2 than option 3, and staff have confirmed that option 3 does increase the size of our existing museum. Option 2 increases the size slightly more, but staff have also confirmed that a large part of that additional size of option 2 was to provide for the possibility of hosting international or nationwide exhibits, of which we might end up having the opportunity to do perhaps once or twice a year maximum, with a great deal of additional staff time and arrangement for probably very little feedback, since their previous experience would be that those international exhibitions do not tend to make money. So for all those reasons, I'm moving recommendation 6 with option 3, and I invite a seconder.
Seconded, Councillor Pottinger. It's open for discussion. Councillor Amundsen.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think Councillor Pottinger has raised a number of really good points, and I know that I've harped on about risk before, and his first point was around the LTP being too ambitious. And as I recall, through the LTP process, we were told that repeatedly, that what we were planning to do was very ambitious. And so I think we have to bear that in mind. I think we've also taken a risk with the CBD block investment, and again, a number of those risks have been realised. We've had to come back and consult with our community several more times. We've had to change how we approach that. We've had to give additional money to that project. I think the reality is risks become real quite often. And my concern is that with option 2, that risk will also become real. Therefore, I would support option 3. I think that what we lose is really only a small amount of space. We've already been told that that you know, it's still a very doable project within that smaller amount of room. I think the only other thing that leads me to have to mention is around consulting our community, and it has been raised already that the community has supported, for the most part, the larger option, the council's preferred option, which is not option 3. And I think we always need to bear in mind that we have to take some caution when we say and speak of listening to the community as the only thing we are supposed to do as part of the consultation process. We do have to listen to the community, yes, but we also have a responsibility to look at everything else. That's why we are elected. And I think in this case, we are still getting a brand new museum. We are still getting fantastic spaces to share our stories with our community and the wider people who might come to Southland and visit. But I think that the risk is not worth it with going with our preferred option, because we are in a really uncertain time. We have heard from people about the pressures that they're feeling with rate increases and increases of all sorts. So to me, it's really the only sensible thing that we can do for the benefit of our community.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I support option 3 as well, the smaller of the two. I think it's an added luxury to have international exhibitions down at a time when things are fairly tight in the city and will be for some time. Unlike Councillor Pottinger, I'm not too worried about the long-term plan going forward. And I say that because I think we have some levers available to us. And so while I put up before that I was uncomfortable about the level of staff advice around the suite of levers that we might have for OPEX, we also have a set of levers that we can use for CAPEX as well, which is the capital stuff. So just to run you quickly through a couple of those.
No, you've done that quite a bit, thanks. We're familiar with the options that are there. It's really, we're getting into the broader financials there. It's really about option 2 or option 3 at the moment. Councillor, you're okay with that?
Well, I've got no choice, have I?
Correct. We've had 3 speakers in support of option 3. Is anyone wishing to speak in support of option 2? Reverend Cook and Councillor Skelt and Councillor Lewis.
Yes, Mr. Chair. option 2 for me is not just because I was part of the envisaging group and therefore somewhat attached to it, but in purely practical terms, as somebody who has been through the existing facility and looked at why we are facing the issues that we're facing right now, which is disjointed buildings that were added on and covered over and all those sorts of things, because at the time that the facility was imagined, they thought they were going to be able to do certain things and it never quite worked out. I really am concerned that not just the debt that we're leaving for the future, if one wants to look at it that way, but the facility that we're leaving for our grandchildren may be something that they look at us and say, why on earth did you settle for less? Because now it's going to be as much again to expand it as it was to build the first facility, and that might only be 20 years down the road. I know that none of us can see for sure what the future holds for us, and I agree that sometimes we can be quite optimistic in our predictions of how things might go, but we can also be unduly pessimistic as well, and I'm not sure this particular facility is the one that we should be pessimistic about. I think we should be optimistic about it. I think if we look at some of the other facilities in the city, that how they're used now is not actually how it was envisaged at the time that they were built, but because the vision was great enough for the facility to be maximised as it is now, and I'm thinking of Stadium, for example, that it has provided opportunities for the city that were never thought of when the building was designed. It's been how it's been operated, it's been the imagination of the people, and it's been how they've engaged with the facility that has expanded how it is. And this is what I envisage for Te Unua. That's my hope, that it will provide opportunities, but it also will provide, for the first time, a proper showcase for the heritage of my ancestors. And that is something that I strongly urge you not to compromise, because we've always been compromised. With the optimum version, there will be no compromise required. And that, I think, is why I am speaking strongly in favour of option 2. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Skeld.
Thank you, through you, Chair, and I can only endorse the comments that have just been made. With option 2, I'm a huge supporter, only from historically being involved in a form of the industry, and I've spoken about this before, with the facilities that we have built in the city, and for some period of time, with all respect to all previous councils, we've lived in a time warp and we haven't made improvements. We've had opportunities, but we haven't done that. That's why we're in the situation we're in today. We haven't made those bold decisions as a council around our facilities. The swimming pool being a classic example. 3 chops we've had at that. We didn't get the Civic Theatre right, for whatever reason. We didn't get the stadium right the first time. We got it right the second time. And look what that's created in the sense of the opportunity for our wider community. Going to option 2, the extended space is the key. And there's some positives and negatives, as we know, but that's the money part. That's the actual gold coin in those exhibitions. That's where the money will come. Because if we bring in an international and national touring, whatever it may be, we can charge and gain some income stream from that. That space has to be multi-purpose, multifunctional, changed up, which it's going to be, or is planned to be. It's a massive opportunity. But we have example after example of facilities in this city that have been built and we've undercooked every time. So we have to have the vision. If we do nothing else, we're going to have a museum for a decade that our young people have not had or been in. A decade. Seriously? and we use our figures, we use our consultation figures, 20,000 plus ratepayers, we have 120 submitters, and we challenge ourselves and we flip-flop when it suits us. We flip-flop on figures when it suits us. Seriously, we have one opportunity. I can only endorse the opportunity we've got. We do not want to be, won't be us, but that next generation of councillors sitting here and saying, hey, we were too small. We didn't build for the future. Build for the future. If someone had told me that 70% of the income from Stadium Southland is from entertainment, I would have laughed at them. Well, that's the figure. That's what has been created by opportunity. Opportunity. This is our opportunity to have something very special, not for a rainy day, but for a really fine day where everybody comes. It's not a rainy day project. This is a sunny day project. This is our goal. This is our new opportunity.
Thank you. Just before I come to you, Councillor Lewis, and I'm keeping from a standing orders point, a tally on the for and against, and we've got one more who can speak in support of option 2. It's worth pointing out that both option 2 and option 3 are larger than the current space available, and I think we should also keep in mind that the current space also includes storage, and that's being shifted to off-site. So just around perspective for both those options. Councillor Lewis, thank you for your patience.
Chair. I try not to be too boring. When the first museum foundations were put down, it was considered big enough. When the alterations were done, it was then considered necessary. The third alteration is done, and so on and so on. I'm very scared that we will be lulled into doing a substandard, and that's, I don't mean in the degree of the planning or the construction, but as far as the demands of exhibitions, I'm dead scared we'll go down that track. Do it once, do it right. There's an old saying, perhaps do it once, do it correctly, maybe grammatically slightly better. There's an old saying, altiora peto. We seek higher things, since we were talking Latin phrases earlier. I don't mean about higher rates, but I'm talking about higher quality, higher and better storage facilities, higher, better exhibition facilities. So I'm strongly in favour of option 2, as I have always been. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Pottinger, you indicated you wanted to speak. You're in support of option 3?
Yeah, well, I seconded option 3, but what I'm doing is I'm actually have an open mind, and the discussions that have been, you know, for and against. And the thing is that, without a doubt, option 2 would be the one to go for. This, I mean, we've talked about it before. We debated everything on the when was it, 23rd of March or 15th of March? We debated that, and it was all around the table. But there's some resounding figures that are coming towards us now that we have no bloody money. And now, when you're trying to balance stuff and choose, do I fly first class or do I just get there in economy? You know, I mean, this, unfortunately, we are really faced between a rock and a hard place about something that we passionately want, and knowing that we are really going to face some terrible times with money. There's no question about that. I've just pointed out $64 million we don't have. So it's great to have the passion, and I love it. But how do you separate trying to be fiscally responsible and at the same time deliver a dream? That's why I see the LTP needs to be revisited, which could potentially allow option 2 and work it that way. But we're not doing that today, unfortunately. So that's why I'd like the new council to actually, for somehow, if we could hold 2 or 3 and let the new council work the LTP and see what could happen then, and they could go through it, and they'd be doing it all over again. A lot of hard work, but for us to make a decision right now just doesn't seem right. Well, you know, some of us are making decisions based on money. Other people are making decisions based on passion. And I don't think you can balance the two, and that's why. So, just my last point is that now, if we go 2 or 3, does that carry through again to the 14th? to be altered on, or are we
No.
really sealing the fate of the museum right here and now?
My intention is we're going to seal it tonight.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's a good idea. I really don't, because a lot of us deep down want option 2, but a lot of us deep down want to keep the finances tight. So I think it's an impossible decision.
So to that, because I'm going to speak in support of option 3, which might come as a surprise since I was the person who floated the idea of putting option 2 as the preferred option for consultation. But I guess part of the responsibility and the oversight that I have as chair of PPP is part of our suite of operations is finance, and Councillor Pottinger's right. And Councillor Amundsen, we had warnings when we went into the LTP process. We have seen cost escalations over the past 12 months. There is stuff around, say, for example, the opportunity to gain revenue. Yep, shops and cafes absolutely work. Touring exhibitions in the museological sector are challenging, and with the stuff that the previous SMAG had, none of it made money. So that is a challenge. That's not to say you can't create some things, but it's very difficult to rely on. And we're in a period where we have listened to submitters talking about the cost of living increase, particularly in a world that is coping with COVID and a military action, or whatever you want to call it, in Russia and the Ukraine, that's shoving the price of oil up, and all costs are going up. And one of the few things that people have an opportunity to have a gripe about is their rates, because we give them that. And it's a time now where we've got to pay some attention to it. And some attention in this sense is about making a more cautious choice, which is in around option 3. Option 3, I think, is about setting a price, but not closing things off. And reference was made before to Splash Palace. Well, one of the things that happened when the original Splash Palace was being built, because the costs started to blow out, is they trimmed off the seating area. And later on, when the place was up and operational and as funds became available, they were able to be clipped on. And I think it's that kind of innovative design that is an opportunity that we're going to have to look at, and taking on option 3 and getting us to a point where we can get something, because I'm acutely aware of how long the place has been closed and the feedback from people, to getting something open on the site and then being able to add and enhance it as affordability changes. So that's why I'm supporting option 3 with a heavy heart at this stage. I can take one more supporter of option 3. Councillor Lush, and just actually before I come to you, I think it's important, because you weren't here for the hearings, that we just confirmed that you did have the pleasure of sitting through the Peter Jackson length video of all of the hearings, and you have read through the submissions.
Yeah, and question me on it if you like. A pleasant 3.5 hours spent this morning watching all of that, so thanks for asking me about that. Yeah, I'm in favour of option 3, because obviously you've known from my criticisms of the vision statement, I don't think it showed the vision that we needed. I don't think, and I think the hard work comes now. Otherwise, we're going to have a museum that's very similar to the museum we've got. It didn't seem to me to show a new direction or something to attract people here, or to really change the narratives around Invercargill. So I think small and punchy is the way to do it. I think the big one, I've sat here and talked to the people about the visiting exhibitions. They couldn't tell me any ones that could be coming down here that would be perhaps ones that hadn't been seen around the rest of the country. So I didn't see the visiting exhibitions being things that would draw tourists to Invercargill. So I think that whole thing about it being a tourist thing perhaps is not quite right. I also think in some ways that what they have done with He Wakatoa has been fantastic. And whether unfortunately not a lot of people are going to see that, but I think that's done the visual arts perhaps better than the Pyramid's done them. So I think that we've got that there during the time the museum is constructed, and perhaps into the future would be a very, very good thing. So I'm in favour of very much of the storage, but I think the smaller museum at this stage is the right one to go for. I think, providing we get the right people give that vision for the new museum. I think this is all very fine talking about the funding and stuff like that, but I think the real hard work comes now. I mean, because if it's just going to be many Deans and lollycake, you know, I just don't think we're going to get the interest in it. We need to actually, and sometimes I think it's the external people that can really see the stories that the world's interested in. I mean, bearing in mind with Burt Munro, it wasn't until the movie came here that Invercargill really celebrated that guy. And I think that's really important that we actually get that overview and get the right stories, not just the stories we've always been told. So I think we can do that with option 3. So that's why I think that's the right thing to go with.
Thank you. So procedurally, councillors and your worship, if you're going to speak in support of option 2, I'll allow it.
I was going to sit on the fence.
No one's spoken in that particular arena, your worship, so I'll give you the opportunity. Just before that, councillors, I think I should let you know it's my intention to adjourn the deliberations soon, once we've taken a vote on this, and it is a heavy vote that we'll be casting, because I'm aware that several people have other appointments that they need to get to, and because we've still got the financials to go through there, we will reconvene those deliberations on the 31st. So just as a heads up, you will be receiving a meeting appointment. My apology for spreading that out. This is a process that in the past we have dealt with in a workshop.
Sorry, point of order. 31st of what?
31st of May.
May, so next Tuesday.
It's a question, it's not a point of order. So that's procedurally where I'm going to go. Okay, just so that you're aware. Your worship, on the fence.
I think that it's one of those issues where we just don't know still. We don't know what, like I was talking to a farmers group and they said, we produce food. This country needs, this world needs food. And just the Ukraine, a third of the world's grain comes from that small country. And so small countries are sort of important in making sure that people can eat. It doesn't really matter about whether you've got a museum or not in your city if you're hungry. And we have never sort of experienced that really except during the Great Depression. Secondly, the new viruses are coming in. Some of them have got really nasty names, and we haven't completely resolved that issue. And issues where you think we'd all be united, like really difficult issues, we just are learning more and more about them. Like we always thought earthquakes would be catastrophic, and then you sit down and watch the news and there's lovely little fishes floating, swimming around, and the volcano had no impact on the environment. So there's just too many unknowns for me, and I think we should put it off until the next council. They're going to have to pay for it or raise the money for whatever option we go for. And we don't want it to look like we're just taking advantage of a quiet period.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillors, is anybody else wishing to speak who has not already spoken? I see you've got your hand up, Councillor Clark, but you've had the opportunity. I'm going to test the meeting and put it to the vote. The motion is we support option 3. All those in favour, if you could please raise your hand. And we'll take a note.
Councillor Clark, are you in favour of option 3?
You've just muted yourself, Nobby.
Through you, Chair, I'm not prepared to vote on this because I've already said I don't think we have adequate information
thank you.
for farmers.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Right?
Those against?
I wish to abstain.
Sorry,
I'll
can we just?
abstain too.
So
Yeah.
I'll come to abstain shortly, just so that we've got a number. Those against, those voting against the motion, can you please raise your hands?
Sorry, just by. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, I'm going to have to go. Thank you. You can put your arms down. We're going to have to go back to those supporting the motion because I'm not sure that we had an accurate count.
I know. Here we go.
Right. Those who are abstaining, if you could indicate now, please. This is your moment, Your Worship. Thank you. 2, 3. Councillor Clark as well.
Yes. No. Abstain.
So the motion is carried. Okay. That brings us to 5:45, which is where I'm going to adjourn the hearing. Look, councillors, I appreciate that last item was not an easy one, and we're actually only halfway through a really difficult process. But as I was starting to say before I got sidetracked, this is a process at this point that we've normally gone through in a workshop, but we're having the debate in public because we want to be transparent and we want to make sure that everything is covered off. We've still got some pretty significant financial issues to go through, and as I say, we will be reconvening next Tuesday, the 31st. Thank you to the staff for your participation. Thank you, councillors. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.